Thank you so much, Liz, and thank you, Tina. For me, it's really a huge honor and privilege to be invited to deliver this lecture. And I feel particularly honored that with this audience. I feel that I'm in the company of people who actually know much more about this issue than I do. And I feel really greatly honored to have this chance to talk to all of you. So thank you to all my sisters and others, all of you here. And I really do believe that, in fact, this particular initiative of bringing out into public view the issues that concern domestic workers is something that is so essential for our economy and for our society that I'm delighted to see this kind of turnout and this kind of awareness. You know, it's true that we've had recently some very public and very high-profile incidents that relate to domestic workers. And that, in a sense, is good because that has brought into public view something that is very commonly swept under the carpet or ignored or not really taken into consideration in India. We've had the infamous case of Devyani Khobragade versus Sangeeta Richards, which was a case, in fact, between two Indian citizens. But it very quickly became an issue of national pride versus US double standards, diplomacy, all kinds of other things entered into this thing, when fundamentally, in fact, it was really a case about the attitudes of private employers to the rights and dignity of the employed. Similarly, we've had horrific instances in our national capital, in one of the most privileged posh areas, in a bungalow belonging to a minister. We've had the case of a migrant woman who actually died because of the physical abuse and torture suffered at the hands of her employer, who was in fact the wife of an elected representative of the country. Now, these cases, when they get this high-profile attention, they are certainly covered in the media, and there is shock and horror. But then the media is quick to say that, you know, all employers are not bad. That's obvious. Of course, all employers are not bad. I think a lot of the public discussion has missed the basic point that this should not be about whether employers are good or bad. It should not be about whether, you know, there are individual employers who display generosity. In other words, what we have to recognize is that domestic workers are not just human beings, but they are workers with all the rights that all other workers in our country have, and that this must be, what we must demand is the social recognition of those rights and that dignity. And it cannot be the whim of a private employer or the generosity of a private employer that determines that. I think the first thing we have to recognize is that, you know, domestic work, the reason why we undervalue it is also related to the attitudes that we have towards social reproduction in an economy generally. It's not just in India, it's in a number of other countries, but I think in India it's extreme, the way we look at issues of social reproduction. Because domestic work, you know, the whole range of work that is done within families and households, and sometimes even within communities, makes a huge contribution to the economy. Not just to society, not just to the comfort of people's lives, but to the economy. And this is something that we don't recognize. And that's why it's not measured properly, we don't recognize it, and a large part of it is unpaid. But you know, in fact, no society would survive, forget the next generation, even in the current generation, without this massive contribution made by domestic work, paid or unpaid domestic work. It is absolutely essential for social reproduction, and in fact it contributes hugely to what we call the national income, even when it is not recognized as doing that. So one of the problems is, in fact, that in India we don't recognize this huge role that is played by social reproduction, which is to say not just the care economy, the looking after the young, the old, the sick, but all of the tasks related to household reproduction, enabling every person in that family to function on a daily basis. All the tasks related to what are called, you know, household indirect income, that is things that you do within the household to save money for purchasing those things. All of those are actually huge contributors, not just to that individual family's welfare, but to the economy. Now, in fact, because of this, because of the fact that we tend to undervalue it, and because so much of it, in fact, in India is unpaid, there is often a direct relationship between how you recognize domestic work and the situation of women in that society. Because it is also true that most domestic work is performed by women, both paid and unpaid. We do have time use surveys that now tell us the contribution of women, and approximately it's about 70% of the unpaid labor time is performed by women within a household. So slightly more than 2/3 of the time goes by women. So it's not only women, it's also men. But definitely women are the dominant contributors in the unpaid activities of a household. But we tend not to recognize it. We don't value it at all. We underestimate it. We don't see the fact that most women are actually working. In India, officially, we have the lowest labor participation rates among many, many developing countries, certainly among all the BRICS countries, all the G20 countries. And what is remarkable is that we have low labor force participation, which is declining. Yet, in fact, that doesn't actually fit with what we know, which is that most women are actually working. When you look around you, you will find that most women are, and I'm sure every woman in this audience knows this, that most women are working. And the paid work is only a small part of that work. Now, in fact, this decline in the labor force participation is quite remarkably, it's inversely related to the amount of unpaid work that is done. And how do we know this? Because, in fact, our national sample surveys do ask about other activities that are performed in the household, which they don't call work. It would become work if you paid for it, but it's not called work when it's unpaid, which is a whole range of things. It's for example, all the tasks of looking after children, taking care of the sick and elderly, preparing food, all home management, cooking, cleaning, etc., all the expenditure saving activities like maintaining kitchen gardens and orchards, taking care of household poultry and cattle, collecting firewood, collecting water, grinding food grains, preparing cow dung cakes, making baskets and mats, sewing, tailoring, weaving, tutoring, all of these. Even when women do this, they're not called workers. This is not seen as work if it is unpaid. When it is paid, then yes, they are identified as workers. But because so much of this is performed by women who are not paid, society tends to undervalue it in general. So because we undervalue all of this domestic work and its crucial role in the economy, we also undervalue even the paid workers who do it. Now, this particular issue, it really is actually a reflection of the low status of women in society, but it reproduces that low status. Because of the fact that we have women who do not get the same kinds of opportunities outside because they are forced to work at home. In fact, the same NSS surveys tell us that around 55% of the women who are doing only these activities are doing it because there's no one else in the house to do it. They're asked, why are you doing this? They're saying, because someone has to do it. This work has to be done, and there's no one else. And therefore, they're not available for outside work. Similarly, in fact, the same women who also go for outside work, somebody has to do that work at home. So they're doing the double burden of working outside and working at home. And not only is the working outside as domestic work undervalued, but the working inside the home for that domestic work is not recognized at all. It is zero valued. So as I said, this is a reflection of the broader situation of women in the economy. And that's why the issue of domestic work, even though the total proportion of domestic workers in India is less female than in many other countries, across the world, it's about 85% of domestic workers are women. In India, it's only just under 60%. It's about 57%. So we don't have such a large proportion of women workers, but most of the increase in fact, in the last decade has been of women. So 75% of the increase in in domestic workers in the last decade has been female. And also about 30% of all the increase in women's work, especially in urban India in the last decade, has been in domestic work. So it is becoming more and more important in the economy as a form of paid work. So then the next question is, okay, why is paid work in the form of domestic work increasing so much in India? And this too is related to what is happening in the economy as a whole. So when you look at the last 10 years, well, really the last 12 years, between 2009-10 and 2011-12, which is when we have the data, what you find is that overall there's a decline in women's workforce participation, or very low growth in most states, but there is a very significant increase in women as domestic workers. Now, what's going on? How is this happening? I would argue that it's reflecting two very related forces. One is the fact that we are just not, as an economy, generating enough employment opportunities. We've had years of very dramatic, rapid growth, okay? We are seen as this we were seen until maybe last year as this huge global tiger that is emerging on the world scene. We are a member of the BRICS. We're going to become the second, third largest economy quite soon. We see ourselves as this big economy that is, entering the 21st century and will be one of the important economic players of the 21st century with very rapid GDP growth, income growth. On the other hand, employment growth has been disastrous. Formal employment, that is employment with any kind of protection, hasn't grown at all. It's flat, zero growth over the last decade. Informal employment is now around 96% of total employment. 96% of workers are informal, of which more than around 2/3 of them are self-employed because they cannot even find employers. And most of the others are employed in casual contracts. In regular work, the biggest form, you see, the way we define regular work is not that it is protected, formal, and legal. The way our data defines regular work is just what do you do every day. In regular work, the biggest increase for women in urban India is domestic work. That's the form of dynamic increase in employment that is going on. And for the other kinds of work, so one of the big things that is happening is that domestic work is really one of the only options available for employment because our economy is simply not generating enough good quality jobs. Therefore, people have no choice but to go and look for domestic work, not only women, also men, but dominantly women. Also because women are willing to work for less, they're willing to work part-time, they're willing to accept worse working conditions, all of those reasons. The second big reason is inequality. Because this is a period when this massive growth has really accrued to, broadly speaking, the top 10% of the population. And also, if you're looking at the income shares, dominantly to the capitalists rather than to the workers. If you look at the share of workers in what we call value added, it's falling continuously over the last decade. In manufacturing, it's really now less than 10%, when it was about 18% just 15 years ago. And so there is significant increase in profits, rent, interest, decline in self-employed incomes and wage incomes at the aggregate level. Inequality in terms of consumption, which is all the data we have, we know is high and is increasing, but we also know that that's an underestimate. Because our sample surveys, they don't go and survey the homeless. They don't go and survey the people in the poorest bastis. They don't go and survey Mr. Ambani either. So you don't get the richest and the poorest in these. So what happens with increased inequality is that you get both more and more people whose incomes are desperate and have to be supplemented through any kind of work, and domestic work, as I said, is one of the few things that is available. And on the other side, you have more and more people who are able to hire domestic workers. It's not just the very rich, it is also the new middle class that is emerging. And the new middle class is able to hire more and more domestic work because of the fact that this inequality permits very low levels of wages for these domestic workers, and it allows women in these professional middle class groups to actually go out and work because they can hire domestic workers. I am a beneficiary of that. I am able to be here talking to you today because I am able to hire people who will cook and clean and do all of those things in my household for me. Now, this is remarkably something which is true across almost all the states of India. If you look at that data, you will find that there is a decline or a stagnation or almost no growth in women's employment of all kinds, not counting the domestic work that they do in their own homes that is unpaid. But there is a significant increase in all of these states in the rate of growth of domestic work. And this is not just true in North India, South India, it's true everywhere. And it's really quite a remarkable feature. What we're also finding is that more and more of this is also migrant women. This was not, I mean, this was always the case. That is to say that migration is associated with, survival strategies, with desperation of very poor households. There have been regions that have sent migrants, particularly, for example, let's say Jharkhand women coming to Delhi, and women in the outer regions of Vidarbha going to Mumbai, etc., etc. But now you find that this a significant increase in the migration of domestic workers, also always of a particular age. So this also creates another set of problems, because migrant women, as Lisa's already mentioned, face particular vulnerabilities. It's bad enough when you are already locally resident, but you have your own networks, you have some protection, you have perhaps extended family, people you know. Often migrant women, especially young women, often children. And the line between trafficking and voluntary migration is a very thin line, because families that are desperate or situations of extreme poverty, you can't really make that distinction, that have you been trafficked, kidnapped, or did you go on your own? Children, especially 15 years plus, they're still children, really. And women up to the age of 30, there is a significant increase in this migration for domestic work. And this reflects part of the inequality I already told you about, but also regional inequality. Some sectors, some centers of dynamism, the National Capital Region is a center of dynamism in that sense. And some areas which are extremely backward, extremely undeveloped, and facing more and more fragile agriculture, more and more fragile existence because of loss of forest access, common property resources, loss of land to mining, all kinds of things. So you find that there has been a significant increase also in migration for domestic work. And as I said, migrant workers have really particular vulnerabilities. They are much more vulnerable even than local domestic workers. So we also have migration increasingly from conflict zones. All of these are suggested not just by case studies and so on, but even by our national sample survey data. So things are not particularly great, as you can see, in terms of the conditions of domestic work. But what is really also surprising is that despite the fact that there is such a significant increase, despite the fact that the economy is so dependent on it, despite the fact that we find this has become the most dynamic employer, we really have not got the social recognition of it, and we haven't had adequate mobilization to ensure the rights and the dignity and the social, shall we say, the social support for domestic work. That's why I'm so happy that the ILO and the UN have chosen this as an important theme, because really it is something that the elite in our country, the middle class in our country, we do not wish to recognize, because we are the employers for a change. It's fine to talk about it when it is somebody else out there and you can say, oh, well, Reliance has done the following things, or so-and-so company has done the following things. When we are the employers and we therefore bear that responsibility, there is much less willingness among the elite and the middle class to accept the significance of the rights and the significance of the contribution to the economy. I think it's important, therefore, to see what can be done. We can always, go on about how terrible things are, and they are, of course, terrible. But we have to look at what we can do about it. And in fact, there is a lot that can be done. Lise mentioned the ILO the Convention on Domestic Work. And in fact, it's very important for India to ratify it. Already, I think 15 countries have either ratified or promised to ratify it. And several others have said they will try and bring domestic laws into accordance with the convention. But supposing we did do it, supposing we actually ratified the convention, what would it mean? Let me just tell you what it would mean. It means, as she pointed out, you would have to respect, protect, and recognize the fundamental principles and rights to work of all these free workers. What does that mean? It means freedom of association, trade unions, for example, the right to collective bargaining, eliminating all forced or compulsory labor, abolishing child labor. It's true, we have actually, legally now, we have included it since 2006 in the list of occupations that children cannot engage in, but I think all of us know that we don't really implement this. I think many of us have seen young people in the kitchens, in the, in the tea shops, in various places who are effectively doing this kind of thing. Eliminating discrimination. It would require protection against all forms of abuse, harassment, and violence. This is very important. We recognize this only when there are really terrible cases, like the death of that worker. But the same case where this woman died, in that same household, there were others who said they had been systematically beaten for 5 or 6 years. And there are many, many cases that do not come to light of systematic or even sporadic violence, abuse of different kinds, denial of food, locking up in rooms, various kinds of punishment. Decent living conditions, fair terms of employment. We still actually allow live-in people to have a mat on the floor in different rooms. We don't insist that they must be given their own private space with their own privacy. There are still many middle-class homes, even in my own campus, I must confess, where the domestic live-in worker is simply allotted a sort of, not even a bed, sometimes a mat or a dari that they roll out in the room. It would mean that they must be informed of the terms and conditions of employment in an easily understandable way. In fact, ideally through a written contract. It would mean minimum wages, if these are defined for other workers. It would mean that the worker must be paid in cash, maximum every month, and that you cannot deduct the fees of employment agencies, which many households still do. कि हमने किसी को प्लेसमेंट एजेंसी से लिया है, वहाँ पे कुछ पैसा देना पड़ता है, वो पैसा मैं आपकी वेतन से मैं काट लूँ. ये सब नहीं चलेगी. Or no in-kind payment except only as a very limited proportion. There are people who say, we'll give you the place to live, and so that's equivalent to so much rent. So therefore, we won't pay you that much salary. The live-in workers must be given space that is not defined as the equivalent of rent. That's also part of this convention. It means that if you're giving food, that doesn't mean you cannot give money. It means that if you are giving other services, and for example, uniforms, protective equipment, and so on, these are all part of the job and the duties of the employer. It would mean that you have to have normal hours of work, overtime pay, weekly rest, as she mentioned, 1 day's and annual paid leave. I, as a worker in a university, I expect my leave. I will be outraged if I don't get my annual leave and my weekend and on all kinds of other holidays. I expect only so many hours of work. Yet, the people who work in homes are often not even given a day off. They have to work 7 days a week. They're not given, or when they are given leave for a month, it is seen as a special gift of the employer. Or when they are allowed to go and visit a sick relative, that is, it's all seen as a gift of the employer rather than as a right of the worker. It's also various things like, the time when you have to be on call, or what are called standby hours. If you remember, this was one of the issues that Sangeeta Richard complained about, that even if the work on a particular day was 8 hours, she had to be available 24 hours. She could be woken up early in the morning, had to work till late at night, could be called at any time. So the time that the worker has to be available also has to be regulated. They also must have the freedom to decide whether they're going to live in the household or outside. They cannot be forced to live in the household. There are measures for occupational safety and health. There are measures for social security. This is a very important thing. Most domestic workers have no social security. They don't get maternity benefit. They don't get anything, really. They have no kinds of the minimum social security, and forget about after pension kinds of benefits. There's also a very important provision, there are provisions for migrant workers. There's another very important provision for fair access to legal and other dispute settlement, because that's one of the things we know, that if there is in fact a problem, not only is it very hard to prove, but the power relations are so skewed against domestic workers that it is really very, very difficult for them to get justice. तो ये जो कानूनी बात है, मान लीजिए ये कानून हो भी गया, तो इसको इम्प्लीमेंट करने के लिए, और मान लीजिए कि किसी एम्प्लॉयर ने नहीं दिया ये सारे हक, तो फिर इस झगड़ा को आगे ले जाने के लिए भी तो सुविधा होना चाहिए. So all of these things are there in this convention. You can see that if we actually do sign this convention, and if we actually do seek to implement it, this is a revolution in the relationship between employers and employees in Indian homes. This is actually, it would be a complete transformation in the way that domestic workers are treated, which is why also it is going to be a tough thing to implement, and it's going to be a tough thing to pass this law. Which is why the story we have so far is that very few states have done anything about domestic workers. Some states, I think there are 5 states, have allowed domestic workers into the minimum wage provisions. Some states like Kerala have passed a domestic wage bill which regulates hours of work for part-time workers and so on. But in general, we really do not have legal provisions for any of these things. But we also all know that legal provisions are not enough. We know that we have lots of laws, and minimum wage laws nobody implements. Even the government of India doesn't want to implement minimum wage laws. You know, it does public works where it's trying to bypass the minimum wage laws. So it's not enough to have a minimum wage law or even a domestic workers law, which, for example, has already been proposed. Not yet tabled, but been proposed. It is necessary, and it is important, but it is not enough. So what I would like to highlight just at the end is that it's not just enough to have the law. It's essential. And it's not going to be easy to get this law, I promise you. But it is essential, but it is not enough. Because to implement this law and to ensure that we get the rights and dignity of workers, we will have to have that pressure from below. And that cannot happen without the mobilization and the association of workers. It cannot happen unless we actually bring all workers together to fight for their rights and to recognize them as rights and not the gifts of employers, a gift of the state. And I just want to mention finally that changes like this are not just good for domestic workers themselves. They are actually very good for society. Because a society in which the rights of all workers are recognized is actually a better society to live in. And it's also better for employers, because it is better to have transparent dealings where you are dealing on terms of mutual respect rather than in a very top-down fashion. It's better even to avoid cases of unfair accusation. So it's better for employers, but it's better for society. And most of all, it's better for all of us if we want to feel proud of the place that we live in. And if we want to live with dignity, we have to recognize the dignity of all the citizens around us. If we want to be given dignity as workers, we must recognize the dignity of every worker, and especially the workers who work for us as well. Thank you very much.